Erica, can you hear me? Okay, great. I'm going to wait just another minute and get started. Stop recording. Oh. So, looks like we've got the recording started. Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you. I was wondering, it was so quiet for a while. I think it just started right straight up at 9 o'clock. Okay, well, welcome to the webinar on beginning and expanding the literature review. I posted a little note there. I imagine you can see it. All the slides are included in the handouts that are attached here, and we'll cover a lot of ground, so I may not take questions until the very end or close to it. Just make sure I get through everything. But feel free to post questions in the chat. Good morning, I see Michael and Carrie and Erica, Alex, Cindy, Shonda, Erica, twice, okay. Anyway, all right, let's get started. So, introduction. This webinar assumes that you've already identified your topic and defined a research question. And you may have already begun to write the introduction to your paper, or you may have started writing your literature review already and written quite a bit but feel stuck. So either way, wherever you are in the process, this webinar will be helpful. Let's see, here we go. Okay. Note that there are quite a few different manuals of styles used at different schools, and I use the APA 7th edition spiral bound. So if I talk about requirements for anything in any context, this is the book I'm talking about. And while APA is tedious, an editor cannot do everything for you, so it's important for you to use some aspects of it while you are writing. These initial tips, I will include some initial tips. We'll just set the stage for how to write, and then we'll talk about how to decide what to write as you expand your literature review. And again, all the information today is provided in the handouts. So a few of the things we'll talk about, what's critical to know before you get started, advanced planning, writing tips, citations, which many of you may know, but I'll cover a few things. Beginning the search, what are credible sources, how to expand both the search and the content you cover, staying on track, how far back do you have to go in the literature, when is it enough? There's definitely a point when you'll know you've got enough. And then some more writing tips, and I'll tell you how to create a literature matrix for identifying cool quotes as you go along. So first section then is getting started. Okay, so just before you get started, I want to say that the focus of the literature review is to summarize and synthesize the arguments and ideas of others without adding new contributions of your own, without speculation. It focuses on building arguments that support your choices in the writing too. So in this section, we'll talk about critical things to do as you write. Some of this includes APA, but as you see, there's a short list here that we'll cover very briefly. Yeah, Adrian, I like the spiral bound too. It works so much better than the 6th edition. So first thing you should, before you start writing, eliminate inappropriate phrasing. As I mentioned, try not to speculate, don't conjecture, don't express hypothetical opinions. Stay really focused on topic, because a dissertation is evidence-based work. If you express opinions, or if you say something is common knowledge, make sure you take credit for this clearly. Like you say, it seems to be common knowledge that. Make sure you differentiate between what an author discusses and your own opinion, or what you consider to be common knowledge. By this, I mean, be very specific. For example, it seems common knowledge that the COVID-19 pandemic began with the shutdowns in March of 2020. You don't have to necessarily find a citation for that. But someone reading your paper 10 years from now may not be aware of it. So while you don't need to cite a source, you do need to make clear statements. And if you wrote something previously, I mean, if you wrote an article and got published, or even something, anything that was peer-reviewed usually is what's considered credible. You have to cite your own work properly too. You would cite, like I would cite, Galindo 2010 stated this. Okay, so you cite yourself as well. Avoid tangents, going off on extraneous streams of consciousness. We'll talk a little bit more about that, staying focused later on. Avoid colloquial phrasing, slang, and acronyms. You don't want to use acronyms throughout because people just may not know what they are, and they don't want to go all the way back to where you first defined them in order to recall what your acronym stood for. So it's really better to write things out, and of course, avoid slang. So, oops, it didn't change slides. Oh, now, new. There we go. Anthropomorphism. I had never heard of this word until I started working on my dissertation. Anthropomorphism means the attribution of human motivation, characteristics, or behavior to artifacts, animals, and natural phenomenon. For example, a report includes information displayed on a piece of paper or in a slideshow or described in a news broadcast. But the report doesn't state anything. It's inanimate. It did not come up with any of these ideas. The author of the report is the source. He or she or they provided the information that's being discussed. So rather than say, the report said this, or the study concluded, which isn't really too bad, but you would be better to write something like what's shown here, stating the author's name. The authors stated or reported or concluded. So avoid anthropomorphism. Citations. Citations are like evidence used to create a strong argument in support of a position, and the credibility of your evidence is crucial. So representing an idea as your own, or even summarizing or paraphrasing or referencing an idea that is not your own is considered plagiarism. And APA does require or encourage that if you paraphrase someone, you still put a page number. It's still considered someone else's idea, and you want to direct the readers to the source. So assuring accurate citations is critical so others can check your presentation of concepts in the original context where they were first written. Dates and page numbers direct a reader to the precise source. So with regard to direct quotes, I also want to say, do not imagine that your editor will fix what isn't there, like a missing page number. I'm a huge advocate of using page numbers just because you're going to be writing for months on months, and you're going to be rearranging things and revising things and adding information, and you might find a new author who talks about something you've already read about, and you want to connect their work together. So you might want to go back and revisit what the first author says, and you'll need a page number. You don't want to go looking for, oh, where did I read that? Where in this freaking book did I read that? And of course, if it's an online article, you can search for key terms, but you know, get the page number, it's easy. So an editor can correct format, but only you have your sources. So my approach is this. My approach to page numbers is to insert them everywhere, especially in the beginning as you're starting off writing. You'll eventually want to take information from your literature review and show how it supports your methodology in chapter 3 and your approach to your research design. This ideas may come up in the literature review, and also in chapter 5 in your conclusions. You want to connect back to the literature, so you will need to be looking up the original sources for context and for accuracy all the way to the end of your paper. So this is another reason I like page numbers. If you do want to use page numbers throughout, even where they're really not necessary, I suggest you talk to your committee or your chair. They should understand your purpose, and because sometimes a committee will say, why are you putting page numbers everywhere? And this is why, and it's a good reason. You're a student, and it's important that you can verify the accuracy of your information later on. If you do use a professional editor, don't let the editor remove the page numbers until the final review. And of course, don't delete your copy of anything. Keep your backups. And this is a tip for at the very end, but if you use an editor, you sometimes want to check whether the editor has actually restated something and misinterpreted your meaning. So you always have to check your editor's work too. So now what to cite? You probably already know a lot of this, but I've worked with a lot of students who were not citing information properly. This isn't a webinar about using a manual style, but you should have style requirements in mind as you write. And make sure you have your university thesis guide or dissertation guide or handbook, whatever that is. You want to look at that now as you're beginning the major part of your literature review, because they may have guidelines that differ from APA or whatever style manual you're using. And usually the university guideline will be the priority. You will have to adhere to that too. And they may give you permission to do things that you want to do, like use color that APA may not like. So anytime you use tables, figures, statistics, dates, quotes, statements of fact, or paraphrase someone's idea, you need to cite a source and use a page number. And do not assume that the reader can figure out who said what. You have to be very careful that when you're writing, you start with the author's names. Sometimes you want to put them at the end, and that's okay, but only if it's really clear that you're using this one author all the way through your discussion, because otherwise, and I'll show you something, I think it's at the end of this webinar, a paragraph that can be very confusing about who said what. All right, so just a quick look at various formats for in-text citation, primary and secondary sources. When you're writing a literature review, these are generally two types of sources that you use. A primary source is the person who, or the group of authors who did a study. A secondary source is somebody who's talking about what somebody else did. So this is how you would cite those. Author X is the primary source. Author Y is a secondary source in this example. And he was cited by author X. Okay, so you say as cited in if you're quoting somebody who's being quoted by somebody else. That was the key of this slide. So in a paragraph, as you're writing, it's the first time an author is mentioned in a paragraph, you have to include the year of the publication. As long as you discuss the same author in the same paragraph without talking about anybody else in between, you don't need to repeat the year. If you return to the initial author after referencing someone else, then you have to cite the year again. And this becomes really important when you have an author who you really like and you're looking at books or articles of his or hers or theirs that have been written, many different articles that have been written over time. So you really want to make sure that, author A may have said this in 2018 and then said this in 2019. So you want to be really clear which article you're talking about. And which authors, of course. And an editor can help fix this later if you mess up the order of these things, but if you left out critical information, like if you have several articles by an author over the years, your editor won't be able to tell what article you're citing. They won't know the right year to insert, so they may just highlight that, and you'll have to go back and figure it out yourself. Okay? They can take out extra information, but they can't put stuff in that you leave out. So be very careful when you're writing to include as much information for yourself as possible. Okay, page numbers and quotes. This is Pretty simple stuff you probably know at this point. 1p for 1 page, 2p's for 2 pages or more. It can be a series of pages or 2 separate pages with a comma in between. Quotes are generally handled in 2 different ways. In-text quotes, the period is at the very end of the sentence. And for block quotes that are 40 words or more, the entire quote starts on a new line, it's indented, and does not use quotation marks, and the citation comes after the period at the end. And again, an editor can really fix this, but you have to make sure you have all the information there for them. Lists are handled like a block quote. They're often easier to read a list that looks like a list rather than listing numerous items in a paragraph. The aesthetic choice seems to be up to you according to APA, but minimize short bulleted lists where you can write in paragraphs. And that's kind of a rule of thumb. And create bulleted lists where you have a lot of items listed in a paragraph, or if the list includes phrases of like 4 or 5 words or more, or complete sentences. You know, sometimes it will be whole thoughts, or it will be titles of something that you'll want to have in a list. And those things are better put in a list than in a paragraph. It's easier to read that way. A list is always followed by a citation, always with page numbers, just like a block quote, unless it's your own ideas that you're listing. So a little bit of discussion here on dates and tense. Instead of saying in the past 10 years this happened, or over the next 10 years it's expected to happen, you should write out the span of years. And the reason for being precise is because somebody reading your work 5 or 10 years from now will otherwise guess an incorrect time span. They have no idea what years you're talking about unless you're putting specific dates. Okay, and another thing that's important, which some committees sometimes get confused on, but you can look in your style manual to see the requirements, is that everything you're finding out there in the literature was written in the past. It was written before today. So your writing is generally going to be in past tense. APA also allows present perfect tense. A lot of times a committee will have you write in the present tense, and then at the end you change everything to the past tense, which is a royal pain, I think, but it's up to your committee, of course. But realize that you're probably going to have to write in the past tense at some point. And make a note of any retrieval dates for any materials you get online. APA doesn't require this for everything anymore, but some universities do. So again, you have to check your thesis guide or dissertation guide and make sure, you know, what is required. But it's helpful to have retrieval dates because some links are not permanent, and the article that you found may disappear. If you can download it, that's great, but it may not be there anymore. So if you have a retrieval date, it tells people that, oh, back then in 2021 in March, that article was there. You know, that's when it was online. Okay, and things get archived too, so those links can change. So backing up statements, if you say, for example, a search of these journals between 2010 and 2020 revealed only a few studies that discussed your topic, this statement must be followed by a deep discussion of the literature that was found, as well as the gaps in the literature in terms of your research question. So keep track of everything you read, whether you cite from it or not. This is your own bibliography, even if you're only required to have a reference list. A reference list only includes the texts cited in your paper directly. A bibliography includes everything you've looked at it. And some schools or committees might require that, whether you use it in your paper or not. You can add up all your journals or studies you've reviewed at the end of your literature review. And then you can go back to the front of it and say that your literature review covered X many journals and X many authors, or whatever you want to say, who provided material between 2010 and 2020. okay? And only during that time of all these, 125 studies reviewed, only 3 really discussed my topic. And that shows that there's a gap in the literature and that your study can contribute something. So keeping track is helpful in this regard. Okay, if you already started writing and didn't know a lot of this editorial stuff that I've been mentioning, we have a webinar called Edit Before Hiring an Editor. There's the link, and you can go back and you can take a look at that and fix whatever you've done so far, because you don't want to have to do that at the very end, really. Okay, so the next section, finding more and more credible resources. Okay, so one way to do this, which is not necessarily my favorite way, but you might find it useful, is you can start a list of studies. For example, your school will give you access to databases. You can start a list of studies and annotate them, or download into category folders, or write a short summary of each one. You can start a list of keywords and ideas, key definitions that you might want to have in a glossary at the beginning of your paper, or keywords that might later be used to search on your paper, just ideas. You can start a list of authors that you find interesting, that you want to make sure you look up again later, somebody you read about as you're going through a book, primary sources of information that you want to get back to and don't want to forget. So remember, again, I mentioned here, if someone else quotes a source, the citation will say as cited in, and these are people you can go and look up later. Ideally, you want to look at the primary sources yourself. Okay, credible resources. How do you tell what's credible? There's a lot of information out there. One way is the crack test. One way is making sure they're up to date, using their reference list, seeing who they cited, if they're in peer-reviewed journals, if they're in academic databases. Meta-analysis of past literature are awesome. We'll talk about that. This helps, all of these things can help expand your search. And studies conducted by others, such as researchers, research groups in your field, in your topic, or other students can also be considered credible resources too. And you can find the student materials in the ProQuest thesis and dissertation database, which your school will probably give you access to. And there may be others as well. I think there's one called Circle as well. So the crack test. Crack means currency, relevance, authority, accuracy, and purpose. So to determine the date of the publication, if it's suitable to your project. Some research questions will take place during a certain time frame. Or your university or your committee might tell you, don't go looking at stuff that was done in 1997 unless you really need that original source. So date of publication indicates currency. Relevance determines how applicable the information is for the purpose of your study. If you find something tangential that sounds really interesting, like if you're studying food banks and you find articles on world hunger from other countries, and you really want to read this stuff later, put it in a folder or put it on a list and save it. But make sure it's really relevant to answering your research question, or you're just spending a lot of extra time exploring things out of curiosity. Authority determines if the source, the author, the creator, publisher of the information is an expert on this subject. Accuracy determines the reliability, truthfulness, and correctness of the content. And this is something you can corroborate with other studies or texts as you go along. You might find that a group of researchers agree or disagree with each other, and that the numbers might be slightly off, or that they match up year after year from different studies. So this helps you determine accuracy. Purpose, determine the reason why the information exists. Okay, so let's talk about this a little bit more. If for currency, you can look at the copyright publication date or posting date. Could there be more recent information on your topic? Or are you trying to show a trend in thought? So these questions are important to how you use material. Relevance, for what audience or level of audience is the information written? Is it written for the general public, or is it written for experts or scholars? Authority, who is the author or the creator or the publisher, or what organization is responsible for producing it? Are they considered credible, like Pew Research or Gallup? Do they have a long history of being credible? That adds credibility to your paper. How do you know if the author is an expert on a topic? Look at their credentials, look them up. If there's an author that you're using a lot or that you're seeing other people cite a lot, that also helps to let you know that this author is considered credible in the field. Accuracy, what indications do you see that information is or is not well researched or provides sufficient evidence? Are you seeing gaps in their, or contradictions in the way that they wrote their article, or the way that they interpreted their own study? Are there questions that you find that are not answered? Think critically about what you're reading. And it's okay to say something like that. If you're reading an article and writing about it, summarizing it, and saying, yes, he concludes this, but he didn't, he doesn't seem to have considered this, which you came up with. So that's great. Purpose, so why was this material written? To inform, teach, or to entertain or persuade? Depending on your topic, if it was an entertaining or persuasive marketing pitch, that might be relevant for what you're writing about, for what you're studying. I don't know what field everybody's in. So it depends on your research question and your objectives. And how might the author's affiliations affect the point of view or the slant or add potential bias? Okay? So up-to-date resources, how far back do you go? Some universities or committees will set a limit on how far back you should go in your literature review. Ideally, I've usually heard 10 years is a limit, but some allow 15 or 20 years. And if you're finding a lot of work was done in a certain time frame that seems older, talk to your committee about it. And on the other hand, if you can live without citing an older text, sometimes you should eliminate it. And why? Okay, well, university limits is one, but it's expected that newer authors have done a great deal of research prior to writing their own books, articles, or studies, just like you're doing right now. They would have examined and discussed any relevant older texts. In fact, you can say author A reviewed 120 texts written between 1954 and 2008 on the subject of UFOs, including original work by noteworthy authors such as author A, B, and C. And this is called a meta-study, or a meta-analysis of literature written during a certain time frame. It covers a lot of ground for you, especially if other researchers in your field are considering this a very noteworthy meta-analysis. It could be very useful to you to cover all that ground. Generally, you'd only keep older material if it's the first critical work by an author in a field, if you really need the primary source and the original source of an idea, an early study that broke ground, or an evaluation of multiple older works. You might also keep older material if you really can use the data, theory, interpretation, illustration, or innovation as it was presented by the original author. Or you may want to demonstrate that as a transition or a trend in the author's thoughts or groups of authors' thoughts from that first publication to a later date, like trends in online learning. You know, how much has that changed since 1995 or 2000 or 2005? A trend in the field is worth going back and looking at more original, older literature. Okay, reference lists and journals. Wikipedia is a good place to actually get leads, although you shouldn't cite Wikipedia because it isn't generally considered a credible academic resource, because anybody can edit the content. However, if you look up something on Wikipedia, look at its reference list, because there might be some really good stuff there. Google, you will find books and articles come up on Google, such as that one I put on the slide for UFOs. Sage is a credible publisher. They're a credible academic publisher. They may have published some of the textbooks you use in your classes. So that might be a really credible book or article on UFOs if you're studying that particular field. Journals, you can find journals on any subject just about. You can put, say your topic is UFOs. You can type into Google Journal of UFOs and you'll come up with some, or Journal of Food Security, and you'll come up with some that focus on those topics. And those sources will probably be credible. They'll probably be peer-reviewed journals, and you can use those articles in your paper. And those articles will also have reference lists, and they may have footnotes, and they may cite other sources. So when you're reading those articles, and articles are great because they're short, then you will find a pattern of which authors seem to come up again and again, and everybody seems to be referencing them. So this is a way to find credible authors and a lot of different information and contradictory points of view. So databases. Well, you should call or email your library today after this webinar, if you haven't already, to find out what databases you can access, because there are probably a lot of them they will give you access to for free. There's also a lot that you can sign up for free, or at least partially for free online. I know JSTOR will let you get your first 100 articles for free. And you can do a Google search for databases on your subject too. Like when I typed in database on ufology, however that's said, the study of UFO sightings into Google, I found sci-fi.com has a UFO database with over 2 million pages of X files. I can use the crack test then to assure credibility. And when I typed in database on food security, I got a USDA government website, which included national and state level statistics on food insecurity, food security, and hunger. And by the way, those are terms you'll want to define if you're using terms like that. And you might find their definition useful as well. So, studies done by others. You should cite the most recent studies on your topic. You should cite the most recent studies on your topic. A great source, as I mentioned, is ProQuest, and looking at other student projects will give you ideas on how to structure your own research. For example, if someone did a study similar to or tangential to your own study plan, what topics did they cover? And did they use authors or meta-analyses or studies that sound relevant to your topic? Check their reference list and read their paper and see what they cited in their literature review. There may be something there you want to get your hands on. How did they divide up their literature review? This gives you ideas on how to categorize and organize information, which you will need to start to do as you're writing. Another good way of organizing your literature review is not only by topic, but chronologically. Each section that you have on topic or on relevant topics to your research question should be organized chronologically as the information was produced. Or a study, for example, an author in 2019 could write about studies done between 2008 and 2012. And another author in 2018 may have written about studies conducted between 2007 and 2015. So to organize this information chronologically by the information itself, rather than the author's data publication, is what is helpful for creating a chronological picture of what's happening in your field, if this is relevant to your topic. So is there anything else about their study that might help you plan or structure or justify yours? What I found was really, really useful about other student papers was how they justified their choices, like their choice of the methodology, they justified their choice of the population. When I found papers that were similar to mine, I was doing a mixed method study, and I was doing live interviews, and I had a mixed method interviews with likely fail questions and open-ended questions and qualifying questions. And anyway, so how did other students do this? I could see what they used, for example, pilot tests. I found another student had a source with 10 major questions to use in a pilot test. After you go through your interview your first time, that's considered pilot test, and you might want to go back and revise things. So you have a list of questions that you ask your first participant, and that helps you fine-tune your interview guide. So anyway, this is something I discovered in another student paper. Although it wasn't relevant to the literature review, it did become relevant to my work in the rest of my project. So you can see how students talk about credibility, trustworthiness, or other measures of value that are essential to your research. In quantitative research, it might be validity or generalizability. In qualitative research, it may be transferability. Anyway, there's a whole list of trustworthiness criteria, which we actually cover in another webinar. I think it's in 2 weeks. So you can find out how other people talk about it in their studies. That's really, really helpful. So meta-analyses, I mentioned this before. Meta-analyses are wonderful. They cover a lot of ground for you. Actually, you can do a search on them. I searched for meta-analysis of food security research, and the first links that came up were scholarly articles on precisely that topic. Exactly. And then links further down on the very first page included the ones shown here. The government link, Science Direct, JSTOR, Cambridge University Press, all very credible sources. So all credible articles or studies will include abstracts, so you can quickly determine if you're interested in what they wrote, if it's relevant to your research question. This will teach you how to write your own abstract when you get to the end of your study too. And each of these websites was likely to include not only article abstracts, but lists of more links to similar articles, downloadable PDFs, and reference lists. And many of them, as I said, have free subscriptions. They just require your email. So this is a great way to expand your literature review. So to describe a meta-analysis, we talked about that a little. Conducting a meta-analysis or a meta-study makes someone an expert and gives your paper credibility. So you might write something like this in your paper. Tinto in 2012 reported he had spoken with professionals at over 400 institutions in the United States. That's where he got his information and drew his conclusions. So he was a very important researcher. Parent reviewed over 400 papers on the subject of my topic, written between 1980 and 2008, many of which were focused on my target population. Okay? And Jones examined 995 papers from 36 countries, published in 45 journals between 1971 and 2012. These are real examples. These are real examples that I used in my dissertation. So he identified discussions regarding information relevant to my topic. So you can find some really great sources this way, primary sources that have done a lot of individual research, and they add a massive amount of credibility to your literature review. Okay, here are a few more examples. Noel Levitz, that's a credible research organization. And you can see how I related this. Oh, you can't see my little arrow. You can see how I related this to my study. People similar to my target population. again, people similar to my target population. This all made this study of 114,138 people extremely relevant. Institutions between 2010 and 2013, of which almost 106,000 were defined similarly to my target population. So you can get very detailed on this if someone has done a study in the past that's highly relevant. And this shows that your study is also intending to add new knowledge to a field that is highly relevant. Okay. Okay, here's a few more tips for expanding the literature review, as if you don't have enough now. I mentioned using the footnotes and citations in a text and the reference lists, and make note of relevant authors. Look up books on Amazon to get an idea of content. If you find books that sound interesting, you don't want to keep buying hundreds of books. So look them up on Amazon, and you can find their table of contents, and often you can find some preview pages. There may be other data center databases that have previews of some of these articles, more than just an abstract, so you can find out more information. The table of contents is really useful before you pay for a book. Okay, go to your local library, and this may sound archaic, but yes, local libraries can be helpful. You can request interlibrary materials, and if you're at an actual physical university, you may be able to get go into their library, and they can connect with other universities around the world, other libraries around the world, and order materials for you. If your topic is relevant to an international context, or if there's an author, a study that was done somewhere else in the world. I had one in Finland, and I actually wrote to the author and got a copy of her paper, and because I couldn't find an actual draft of it. And your library can get you materials from elsewhere that you can borrow for weeks or maybe months, it depends, at a time. Okay, books, articles, journals, a series sponsored by an association or reputable group in your field. I was going to say something else about library, but just skipped my mind. Anyway, libraries are great resources, and they can usually copy. There usually is a limit on how much they can copy. If they can't get in a text, they might be able to copy 10% of it due to copyright laws. So if there is one chapter in a book that you really want to read, they may be able to get that chapter or for you. So it's worth hunting down if you find something like that. So up-to-date resources. As you review resources, try to replace all your older sources that are over 10 years old with newer ones if they exist. This is just a general principle, rule of thumb. Not all committees will require it. If you only cited an author once or twice in your paper, how important is that citation? Can you eliminate it? Is there a newer edition of the same book or a later article on the same subject by the same author? Sometimes you'll notice a trend in thought. They may change their mind or discuss this trend. And sometimes a newer book will have the exact same quote as an older book. So you can basically just change the year and the page number in your citation, and it brings your paper more up to date. Or you may want to cite them both to show that you've done your homework. So what not to use as you expand your literature review? If you aren't sure about legitimacy, do not use news broadcasts. They're not great sources unless you're studying them or current events. Use wikis only for leads. Term paper repositories may not be peer-reviewed like dissertations. Summaries, overviews, and study guides are not primary sources, and neither are reviews of someone else's book. Okay. So staying on track, and when is enough enough? No one begins a dissertation without having passion for their study. So stay on topic. You have a research question or a hypothesis to guide you. You will be curious and you will want to go off on tangents, but if the interest of saving time and getting to the point, you will want to put those in a folder for a future date. For example, I mentioned earlier, say you want to help your local food bank combat food insecurity issues in your city, but then you think, what about world hunger? Well, you can't solve all the problems in a student research paper. So set it aside. You have deadlines set by your university, and scheduling is what is really important about this particular slide. You should consider scheduling at least 20 hours a week. You might put in 6 hours on Saturday or Sunday morning and spread out the other 14 hours during the week. Each block of time set aside should allow you at least 2.5 to 3 or even 4 hours of uninterrupted time, which is really important, uninterrupted time for your research, okay? And actually, we're going to do a webinar next week, dissertation research starting from scratch, with talks about how to schedule, how to create a schedule for yourself in order to give yourself a life-work balance, because you do need time with friends, family, you do need a leisurely dinner, a couple times a week. So I don't believe in this 15 minutes a day. I think there should be a couple of days when you're completely off, okay? So check out that webinar. I see a question here regarding the library. Our library provides online access to many of the books. This saves a lot when you're looking for specific chapters and don't need the whole book. Great information, Erica. Awesome. And Monica, our podcasts feature incredible authors in your area of expertise appropriate to reference. Podcasts, you have to know something about the author. Remember the crack test. If they're credible authors, like you said, leaders in your area, then yes, it's appropriate to reference. Instead of putting a page number when you quote someone, you usually put the timestamp. You can pause it right there and see where it is in the podcast, and you'll get the timestamp of where that quote is that you want. So staying on track, continued here. Maybe start out with essays on each of your major claims. This is a chunking strategy. You develop the list of the claims, analyze for clarity and relevance to the research question, and justify your statements. Describe alternative bodies of evidence used in your review, contrasting and comparative opinions. Reflect on the type of reasoning and logic you use to formulate your argument, and then build your case for each of these claims that you want, if this is relevant to answering your research question. For example, if your thesis states that participatory leadership is the most effective style for 21st century organizations, then the data in your literature review must support and prove this conclusion. So one thing I do want to say here real quick, this paper is just one step in a lifetime of research that you have ahead of you, a lifetime of reading. You need to complete just this one step and graduate, and then you can go on to anything else that interests you in the field. So staying on track is really important in this context, because you're always going to find interesting authors or papers or topics for postdoctoral reading and writing. Okay. So when have you done enough? You'll know when you've done enough reading when the authors you're reading start citing authors you already read. At that point, you've reached what's called saturation in the literature. And when the committee doesn't have any more suggestions for additional reading, that's another way you'll know. But some committees keep putting more and more on your plate. I had a student like that. Oh my gosh, her committee chair sent her 11 pages of links and annotations and notes, and she was already on deadline for submitting her final draft. So you just have to sometimes set your own cutoff point, develop your own parameters. She was in action research, so yes, the action stopped in October. We're not looking at much more information past that, okay? But basically, you'll reach saturation when you start reading about authors, talking about authors that you've already read. You're going in circles then. If you're working with current events, you do need a cutoff date. Okay, next section, additional tips. Okay, while writing, the focus of the literature review, as I said before, is to summarize and synthesize the arguments and ideas of others, but without adding new contributions of your own and without speculation. You summarize individual studies or articles with as much or as little detail as each merits, as in terms of its comparative importance in the literature, remembering that the space you give it denotes the significance to your topic, to your research question. When you're writing, you can provide the reader with a strong umbrella statement under the header of that section prior to a discussion. This will help you too as you continue to organize and reorganize, because you'll see these umbrella statements and they may actually become headers at some point. And then provide a brief so what summary at intermediate points in the review to aid in understanding comparisons and the flow of your analysis. So if your attempt to create significance doesn't seem very strong, then you know it's okay to throw this idea out the window. You can just copy and paste it onto a separate piece of paper, stick it in a file and say, maybe. And later you can go back and read it and see if you really even need that. So you will divide your literature review into sections and talk about various aspects of the topic or various aspects of how this is relevant to your research question. As I mentioned, talk about each aspect chronologically, the entire literature review, each section, major section should be as chronological as possible. You cannot draw conclusions regarding the need for further research in Chapter 5 without summarizing what is already there in Chapter 2 in your lit review. You cannot say there's a gap in the literature until you cite the most recent literature on the topic with regard to answering your research question, demonstrating that you still can't find the information that you want on the narrow subject that you have chosen to research. Oops. Okay, be sure to summarize. While you're writing, keep an eye on researchers who feel the same way or who feel the opposite way about a subject. You'll start to notice this naturally. For example, my student with food security, she found researchers who felt that food banks were part of the problem, and she found researchers who felt food banks could be part of the solution. Her approach was, she wanted to try and make food banks be part of the solution in her community. So you want to combine this information to show that there are two opposing sides of thought, or maybe there are three. However many you find, the strategy is to summarize and combine key articles. If you discussed some researchers, plural, you have to cite more than one. You can't just say some researchers feel this and then only cite one article. You have to, unless that article describes 300 papers that they've read, in which case you should say so. Summarize major contributions of significant studies and articles to the body of knowledge under review while maintaining the focus established by the introduction. Evaluate the current state of the art for the body of knowledge reviewed, pointing out major methodological flaws or gaps in the research, inconsistencies in a theory or findings, and areas or issues pertinent to future study. Conclude by providing some insight into the relationship between the central topic of the literature review and a larger area of study, such as a discipline, a scientific endeavor, or a profession. Okay, so a literature matrix. I wanted to go over this briefly. Going close in time here. So this is just an option that may help some people organize their thoughts. You can create a table in Excel or in Word and identify 25 or 30 of the most critical authors in your reference list, the name of the publication, the date of the publication, the link, the key theme or theory or content type. Provide, some schools require retrieval dates, as I mentioned before. You should probably put a retrieval date there in case it gets moved to an archive later. Identify key quotes under 40 words and put a page number, and identify key quotes 40 words or longer just by putting the page number in your table, as a reference for yourself. This is for your own use, and it's to help you organize information if this works for you as a literature matrix. It can be a helpful organizing strategy and bring out quotes. You might use this kind of a strategy in your if you do interviews, and for organizing interviews, it's called coding strategy as well. So the general rule of thumb is that no more than 10% of your paper, sometimes 20%, should be in quotes or should be direct quotes. Although doctoral committees and universities may require more or less. Some let you have 20% of your paper in quotes. Many schools will use Turnitin, plagiarism software, and if you say something that you haven't cited, that's considered plagiarism. So make sure you put those quotes on anything that you write, and if you paraphrase, use a citation. If you think you have a lot of material you'd like to quote, be sure to check with your committee and check with your school. Generally, quotes provide relevant, succinct information that you could not say any better or briefer yourself. That's the reason to include a quote, or a major insight on an important point or statistic. Otherwise, paraphrase and cite. Okay, these are just some helpful websites and a list of the handouts. And I think I've left about 6 minutes for questions. If anybody has questions, that was close. I will scroll back here in the chat window to see if I can find any more questions. Will we send out the recording? Yes. I think it comes out within a week, usually in an email. Okay, I don't see any more questions. Does anybody have questions? If not, we are reaching the end. I will hang out for a few more minutes in case you think of something. If you want me to go back to a certain slide, or take a look at the handouts and see if you have any questions on the handouts real quick. We have handouts on, let's see, I included 7 quick lessons for qualitative research, writing a short literature review, the slides, and an APA cheat sheet are included in the handouts. Thank you, Kayla. I'm glad this was really helpful. I think you'll find the handouts helpful too. Maybe even worth citing. Where are the handouts? They are on my screen. They're at the top. There's a chat button, and right next to that there's a handout button. Oh, good, you found them. And if you can't find them, or if they don't download properly, whatever, you can write to Siobhan. Her email is on the landing page, I believe, and PD Education, Doctoral Net, and they will send you the handouts by email. They have them already. Thank you, Erica. I'm glad you found it useful. Oh no, 7 quick lessons is identical to writing a short review handout. Okay, I will look into that and see if I just labeled them or named the same thing twice. Thank you for bringing that up. Let's see. Quick lessons. Owen and Ashton should be 2 different ones. Preparing a qualitative research-based dissertation, lessons learned. should be by Bowen. That's 7 Quick Lessons. Ashton, writing a short literature review by William Ashton. They're coming up correctly for me. Alex, I will check what got uploaded. But in my file, they are the correct 2 different articles. I'll make sure Siobhan has both of them so you can request them from her. Let's see, writing a short preview. Writing a short literature review and 7 Quick Lessons preview. Oh, you're right. It got uploaded wrong. I wonder why. Let's see. Let me see if I can send that to you. I can upload another one.